Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Chinese economy, and specifically to talk to you about a Chinese property developer that recently defaulted on its debt. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, is this really worthy of another video? Aren't all of the Chinese property developers defaulting on their debt? And you would have a point if you were thinking that. But what I want to talk to you about today is a small developer that's recently defaulted on its debt that's now being sued by some of its creditors. And this is a potential landmark case because the owner of this developer is actually the Chinese state. And the Chinese state, as part of a bailout back in 2021, stepped in and provided some guarantees to the creditors of the bonds for that company. And those creditors are now trying to sue against those bonds. And effectively what they're doing is suing the Chinese state for recovery of their money. And this could potentially open the floodgates for a whole host of other court cases against China. Now, the key issue at the centre of this case is what's called a keep well agreement, whereby a parent who's based in China of an overseas subsidiary provides a loose guarantee. So it's not a formal guarantee. You can't sue under default of that actual document, but it's a loose guarantee that they will agree to keep that company solvent in the event that it's having trouble making all of its payment obligations. And I think what's really interesting in this situation is that these keep well agreements were put in place when the parent company knew full well that the property developer in question was in financial difficulty and so was therefore unlikely to be able to make all of those payments on an ongoing basis. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the company in question, which is called China South City. And when I say this is a small property developer, it's got around $8 billion worth of debt. So it's not really that small, but it is small when you compare it to companies such as Evergrande, which has $300 billion worth of debt. We'll talk about what happened in 2021 when the Chinese state stepped in and bailed the company out because it was defaulting on all of its debt obligations at that time. We'll then have a look at these keep well agreements that were actually inserted into some of the company's bonds at that point in order to encourage all of the bondholders to extend the actual maturity of those bonds and also to reduce the coupon, which reflects the fact that they believed that there was a reduction in the risk profile at that point, that they were more likely to get their money back. We'll then talk about the recent defaults that have happened on those bonds and the subsequent court case that's being brought against the Chinese authorities. And we'll have a look at some landmark rulings that were made in Hong Kong recently relating to these keep well agreements. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in this case and what the implications of this are for the wider property developer market in China, because it's potentially likely that there are hundreds, possibly thousands of bonds that now have these keep well agreements in them. And this could represent a turning point in terms of the legal action that's available to bondholders in the event that they don't get paid. But before we get into all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. You're really helping to keep the channel going. I really appreciate it. China South City is a Chinese property development business that's focused on the city of Shenzhen in the south of China, that's listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and also is a Hong Kong registered company. And the reason that that's important is that it allowed the company to issue international bonds. And the total debt that the company has currently outstanding is around $8 billion. And around $1.5 billion of that is in international bonds. So that's in US dollar denominated bonds that have been bought by overseas investors. Now, back in 2021, the company found itself in extreme financial difficulty and it was struggling to be able to keep the interest coupon payments on the bonds going. And as a result of that, the Chinese authorities decided to step in and provide the company with a bailout. And in December 2021, it was announced that 29% of the company had been acquired by Shenzhen SEZ Construction and Development Group, a unit of Southern China City's local state asset regulator, in a deal that was valued at around $245 million. Now, at the time that the bailout was announced, it was expected that the parent company would inject a large amount of cash into the company in order to solve its financial problems. But that actually didn't happen. And rather, what happened was that the parent company stepped in and tried to renegotiate the terms of the existing bonds by offering what's called a keep well agreement, which is basically a very loose form of guarantee, which says that in the event that the company itself fell into financial difficulty and couldn't make those payments, the parent would do everything within its powers to try to ensure that it remained solvent. So let's have a look at the deals that were renegotiated as a result of this change of ownership. At the time of the bailout by the Chinese state, China South City had 5 international bonds that were due to mature during 2022 and 2023. And so the first job that the new owners undertook was to sit round with the bondholders and renegotiate the terms of those bonds to both extend out the maturity date and also reduce the interest coupon that the company was paying. In August 2022, the company published this announcement on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, confirming that it had agreed to change the terms and conditions on the 5 bonds with the majority of its bondholders. The first thing that was agreed for all of the bonds was that the interest coupon would be changed to 9%. And this represented a major achievement for the company because 4 of the bonds were priced at a significantly higher level. There was a $370 million bond priced at 10.75%, a $346 million bond priced at 10.875%, a $348 million bond at 11.5%, and a $225 million bond priced at 11.95%. The only upside for bondholders was the $276 million bond that had previously been priced at 7.25%, increasing to 9%. The next issue that was agreed with the bondholders was to push back the maturity date to dates in 2024, ranging from the 12th of April to the 11th of December. So this gave the company breathing room in terms of having to find the actual cash to either repay the bond or, more realistically, trying to refinance those bonds in the international market. At that point, the company believed that the market would be improving in 2024 and therefore it would have a realistic chance of finding new bondholders. But obviously that subsequently has not happened. And then the final thing that was changed in terms of the key issues of this bond, and probably the most important in terms of what we're discussing today, is the inclusion of a keep well deed in all 5 of these bonds. So basically this was a loose form of guarantee that the parent company, Shenzhen SEZ Construction and Development Group, which is owned by the Chinese state, was giving to all of the bondholders. And this diagram provides a graphical illustration of the legal structure involved here. So the creditor that we're seeing here are the bondholders. So these are all of the institutions that are holding bonds issued by China South City. So they've provided the debt. The debtor is China South City. So that's the Hong Kong-based company that has issued the bonds and has an obligation to repay both the interest and also the principal repayments. And the keep well provider, or the parent here, is Shenzhen SEZ Construction and Development, which is owned by the Chinese state. And that company has issued the keep well deed to the creditors. So the creditors therefore have a direct link to the parent company, which is effectively owned by the Chinese state. And as highlighted here, keep well deeds do not constitute a formal guarantee. However, the creditor has a breach of contract claim against the keep well provider if the debt is not repaid. And that's the situation here, because China South City has now defaulted on its debt obligations. China South City had an interest payment that was due on the 26th of December that it wasn't able to pay, and under the terms of these bonds, all of the companies have a 30-day grace period. So that took it through to the end of January. And at that time, it also had another payment of 11.25 million that it was unable to pay. And the company has now announced that it doesn't have enough cash and therefore is formally going into default. On the 9th of February, China South City issued the following statement to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, which said, In recent years, due to changes in the external environment, the company's sales have been below expectations, and our cash flow has only been sufficient to fund our daily operations. The cumulative effect of the above factors has put an increasing strain on our working capital. As a consequence, we are experiencing much difficulty in repaying the principal of and interest on our debt obligations. Since 2022, we have taken various proactive measures and have successfully extended the maturity date on our offshore US dollar denominated bonds several times. However, our operations and financial situation have not yet sufficiently improved. As a result, we do not expect to be able to make the mandatory redemption payment due on the 9th of February 2024 with respect to the October 2024 notes, which will lead to an event of default. Moreover, we do not expect to be able to make the interest payment due on the 12th of February with respect to the April 2024 notes, which would lead to an event of default on the 13th of March 2024 if such interest is not paid by such date. As such, it may trigger an event of default under other indebtedness that could cause us to fail to meet obligations under our outstanding indebtedness, which would have a significant material adverse effect on our business operations and financial condition, including possible insolvency or other forms of restructuring. We've been actively seeking to obtain financing and working on generating sufficient cash flow to meet our financial commitments and secure the February interest non-payment and failure of February mandatory redemption. We are considering different options, including but not limited to consent solicitation, schemes and exchange offers, and will provide an update to the market as and when appropriate. So China South City is now in default and is potentially facing liquidation. So that's nothing new. As we discussed at the start of today's video, there are lots of other developers in the same situation. But what is new is that the creditors are now trying to sue under the Keep Well agreement, and effectively what they're doing is suing the Chinese state. A group of China South City's bondholders have formed a so-called ad hoc group and is preparing to file a lawsuit in Hong Kong courts against state-owned Shenzhen SEZ Construction and Development Group, which owns 29% of the business. The lawsuit will be filed using a Keep Well provision, which the state-owned shareholder had provided, and this will be the first such lawsuit against a state-backed developer in the property sector for recovery of payments owed to creditors under Keep Well provisions since the industry tipped into crisis in 2021. When interviewed, one of the bondholders stated, "People like myself got into this bond because of the Keep Well clause," adding that the introduction of that provision and a state-owned company provided confidence in the deal. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with China South City is really interesting, because this is a relatively unknown developer. We haven't been talking about this company before. It's relatively small when you compare it to some of the giants in the industry such as Evergrande. But as with a lot of situations like this, what happens with a small company can become really important if there's a landmark ruling which can be used against other businesses. And that's what we're talking about in today's video. What happened back in 2021 was that this company was facing insolvency. It didn't have the money to keep paying its interest on all of the coupons, and a lot of those bonds were actually starting to mature. So they needed to find ways of either repaying the bonds or refinancing them. And obviously in 2021, that would have been completely impossible. So rather than letting the company go bust, the Chinese authorities stepped in and organised a takeover of 29% of the business. And I think it was 29% so that it didn't trigger a formal takeover. They didn't need to buy all of the rest of the shares. They were buying a significant minority, but it wasn't more than 30%. But by doing that, it changed the credit profile of that business, because in theory, they then had the state standing behind them. And all of the bondholders were very happy about that situation. And so when the company asked the bondholders to come around the table and renegotiate the terms and conditions of those bonds, they were all prepared to do that. And as we saw in today's video, they actually agreed to cut the margin, to reduce the amount of interest that the company was due to pay, which obviously is crazy because the credit profile risk at that point was going up. The whole industry was going into meltdown. The property sector was completely collapsing in China. And so the last thing that you'd want to do as a lender is to reduce your interest margin, but that's what they agreed to do. They also agreed to extend the maturity profile, and all of that was because there was these keep well provisions added to the loans. They had this guarantee from a state-backed entity that in the event that the company itself didn't have enough cash, that they would step in and help out. Well, that was what was meant to happen. Now, obviously, what's actually happened in reality is that the company hasn't actually been able to improve its trading position because the market is still in dire straits. It doesn't have any cash. And so it's now got to the point where it's made a statement saying, we can't make the interest payments, we're unlikely to be able to make any future payments, and actually we might actually be insolvent. And so the creditors are obviously looking to the parent company, looking to the Chinese authorities to sort the situation out. And they are doing nothing. The keep well agreements that have been added to these bonds aren't worth the paper that they're written on. They have absolutely no substance. And in response to that, the bondholders have now decided that they want to take legal action. They're bringing action against the Chinese state. And what's really interesting is that in 2 recent court cases, the Hong Kong courts upheld these sort of actions. They said that it was legally possible for all of these actions to be brought against the issuers of the keep well agreements. So essentially, they've opened the floodgates for potential legal action. And I think what's going to be really interesting over the course of the next 6 to 12 months is to see just how many of these sort of deals have been agreed, because the Chinese authorities didn't want to step in with a big bailout amount of cash. They weren't offering all of these property development companies large sums of money to be able to build out all of the unbuilt property. What they did in the situations where they did provide some sort of support is essentially put their name behind these companies, and there is a genuine possibility that there are hundreds and thousands of bonds out there that have these keep well agreements that have been added to them over the last couple of years. And if this court case does proceed, then it's likely that we will see a myriad of these cases coming against the Chinese state, hitting the Hong Kong courts. And I guess the big question is, will those court cases be successful? Will they able to get the ruling in their favour and tell the Chinese authorities that they have to stump up billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in cash potentially? And then if they do get that ruling, will the Chinese state ever pay? Will you actually get the money? Or will this just be a point of principle? So the overall summary of today's video is that what we've seen in this situation is a really interesting court case appearing as a result of a failed bailout from the Chinese state. What they wanted to do is just keep everybody happy, kick the can further down the road to wait for things to improve. Unfortunately, the property market hasn't improved over the last 2 or 3 years in China. It's actually getting worse. And what we're seeing now is some of these businesses are starting to collapse. They're going into insolvency. They're becoming illiquid. And over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, we could start to see the failure of more property development businesses in China, and that's likely to have a domino impact on the rest of the market. And so the Chinese authorities have a really big decision now. They'll either have to stump up a lot of cash to save these companies, or they'll let them go down, and we could see the whole market imploding. And that would be extremely bad news for the Chinese economy, because the property sector makes up around 25% of GDP. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.